about Groucho Marx and the Marx Brothers. For those of you who do not know Steve Stoliar, he grew up and was born and grew up in University City, and he is a writer and a producer and a voice actor. He also wrote Raised Eyebrows, which is what we're going to talk about today, and he had the personal experience of being and living in Groucho Marx's house for quite a few years until Groucho passed away. For those of you who haven't read the book yet, as I told Steve, I was not a Marx Brothers fan, but I really liked the book and I've really learned a lot. So without further ado, I want to welcome Steve and enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you.
Welcome.
A pleasure to be here. I understand that you folks have set the record for attendance at one of these things, so I will try to speak up for the people in the back. By the way, I'm not using one of the Zoom cat filters, so if any of you are seeing me with the face of a cat, you need to adjust your medications, and you should speak to a physician, which is way out of my league. Thank you for the introduction. I was supposed to be introduced by my cousin Jackie, but she informed me that she got an appointment to get her COVID vaccine and was concerned about possible side effects. I can't believe that she would choose possibly life-saving medication over introducing me, her cousin. But, you know,
I wish she had asked me, Steve, because I would have done it. You're my cousin too.
We got there anyway, but
yeah.
Now I know where my priorities are. Anyway, as previously stated, this is the cover of the book that I seem to have written. Judy, you got that queued up perhaps to illustrate what I'm saying? And I'll just keep talking. Et voila. Raised Eyebrows, My Years Inside Groucho's House. It is about my years inside Groucho's house. An astonishing coincidence. So then this is one of those rare books you can judge by its cover. That is what it's about. Dick Cavett wrote the introduction, for which I remain grateful. And although you can't see the back cover, there are blurbs from Steve Allen and Jack Lemmon and Dick Cavett. And Woody Allen said that it was one of the best books about a show business icon he'd ever read, which was extremely gratifying. But before we get into the book and my experiences with the Marx Brothers, I thought I would tell you a little about my background. Okay, so there I am again. As was previously stated, I was born in University City, 7541 Cornell, University City 30, before there was full zip codes. ZIP, by the way, stands for Zoning Improvement Plan, for those of you who are wasting your time taking notes. My phone number was Parkview 73529. That's how far back it was. And we only lived there till I was pushing 8. But I have very fond memories of my early childhood in St. Louis. This is a terrible thing to say this week, but I really miss the snow. I didn't have to drive in it or shovel it. I only had to play in it and make snow angels and have snowball fights and so on. I really miss the snow and I miss lightning bugs. I lived in New York for a few years in the early 80s and they had lightning bugs there. It was nice of them to import them for my enjoyment. But I do miss lightning bugs as a kid. And I have very fond memories of the Art Museum and the Forest Park Highlands, which aren't there anymore. And we did move before the arch went up. So the arch doesn't pluck any heartstrings with me. even though I know it's become a symbol of St. Louis. But our family moved to California in 1962 because of my dad's job brought him out here. And at the time, my images of Los Angeles were impacted by TV shows like I Love Lucy, where she would meet famous people. She'd go to a restaurant and meet a famous person. And that was my image of California, where no matter where you turn, there's celebrities. And on the plane flying out here, Andy Griffith was sitting several rows ahead of us, and Red Skelton was sitting directly in front of us. And I thought, it really is like I Love Lucy. We haven't even landed in California, and there's already 2 big TV stars here. And Red Skelton was very sweet. He had one of those pop guns, those wooden pop guns with a cork on a string where you push the back and the cork pops out. And he kept that tucked into his sport jacket. And every now and again, he'd turn around and he'd shoot me with it. I'm sure he wouldn't get past airport security now, but in 1962, you could smuggle a pop gun, especially if you were Red Skelton. So anyway, that was my introduction to celebrities. And in terms of the Marx Brothers, I don't know when I officially discovered them, but I will say that my Uncle Joe was balding, had a mustache, wore glasses, smoked a cigar, was very funny, and wiggled his eyebrows. So when I did finally become accustomed to Groucho, I thought, he's just like Uncle Joe. I did not realizing that the other came first. So before getting back to my interest in the Marx Brothers, I thought we would do a quick primer, either to remind some of you or introduce some of you to the Marx Brothers themselves. So in this slide, we have here soon that Judy, who is operating the images, is bringing up. Those are the 5 Marx Brothers from top to bottom: Groucho, Zeppo, Harpo, Chico, not Chico, because he chased chicks. He was named, and caught them frequently. He was named Chico, and Gummo on the bottom. This is a publicity shot taken on the set of Duck Soup. The 5 Marx Brothers were never an act at the same time. There were 4 Marx Brothers, Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and Gummo in vaudeville. And then Gummo was drafted in World War I. So he was replaced by 17-year-old Zeppo as the straight man. Chico, second to the bottom, was born in 1887. Harpo, one above him, in 88. Groucho in 1890. Gummo in 1892. And Zeppo, the baby, in 1901. Gummo was called Gummo because he wore gum-soled shoes or rubbers on his shoes, even in nice weather, because he was a sickly child. Chico, as I say, chased chicks. Harpo, gee, how did he get his name? I was actually on a radio show once, and the host said, which was the brother that played the harp? And I wanted to say, take a wild guess, pal, but I was nice. And Groucho, you know, there's several theories on Groucho, but the truth is it fit his personality. He was not named Warmo or Corgillo. He was Groucho. And as a matter of fact, their mother, Minnie, who was a typical stage mother that pushed her boys into the business, Minnie's nickname for Groucho was Der Dunkel, which means the dark one, because he seemed to be moody and brooding. So that's how he became Groucho. Zeppo, I've never read a really good account of how his nickname came to be. Groucho talked about when the Zeppelin landed in Lakehurst, New Jersey, but that was long after Zeppo had his name. Also, for a while, they lived in Chicago in vaudeville and gave each other hick farmer names like Zeb and Zeke. Howdy, Zeb. Howdy, Zeke. And so from that may have come Zeppo, but we really don't know. That's the truth. So here we have all 5 Marx Brothers. But as I say, the ones that became famous on Broadway and on screen were the 4 Marx Brothers, who we will see in this next, there they are. Upper left, Zeppo, and then Groucho, Harpo, and Chico going clockwise. They became big stars on Broadway in the 20s in I'll Say She Is and the Coconuts and Animal Crackers. And then they started making movies. The first 2 movies were adaptations of their stage hits, Coconuts and Animal Crackers, and those were shot on Long Island in Paramount Studios there. Then in 31, they moved to California and continued their Paramount contract, making what I think are their 3 funniest films, but of course, to each his gout, as the French say. They made Monkey Business, Horse Feathers, and Duck Soup. And then Zeppo was never really happy being on stage. He didn't have much funny stuff to do. He was sort of the romantic lead in a couple of the films. And he gets, there's a lot of, amongst Marx fans, there's a lot of teasing about, that he was uninteresting and dull and didn't really add much. But, once you subtracted him from the act and started substituting him with some of the romantic leads that they ended up with, you ended up missing Zeppo. But he didn't miss it. He was always uncomfortable as a performer. So he started a talent agency and did really well with it. He represented such forgotten bit players as Clark Gable, Carol Lombard, Barbara Stanwyck, Robert Taylor, Lana Turner, Lucille Ball. So he did really well, and he never looked back. He did not miss the limelight at all. So in 33, after Duck Soup, Zeppo left the act. So then we subtract 1 from 4, and we get the next slide, the 3 Marx Brothers. The ones with whom you are probably most familiar, Groucho, Chico, and Harpo. That is them on the MGM lot in 1935 during production of their first MGM film, A Night at the Opera, which I'm sure more than a few of you have seen. When their Paramount contract expired, they were thinking of going back to Broadway. I think George Kaufman had another play that he was considering putting them in. But Chico played poker with Irving Thalberg, the boy genius at MGM. And Thalberg said, here's what's wrong with the movies you guys were making. There's too many laughs. Strange criticism for comedians. Too many laughs because the audience is still laughing and you're still delivering lines and they're missing half the jokes. I could make a picture with the 3 of you that has half as many jokes but will make twice as much money. And so they signed up with Thalberg. And, at the time, MGM was the Rolls-Royce of movie studios. All the studios had well-known stars, but none of them had Gable and Garbo and the 3 Barrymores and Joan Crawford and Robert Taylor. It was the classiest of the studios, which meant a lot to them. And in fact, Night at the Opera and the follow-up, Day at the Races, had half as many laughs, but ended up being their biggest money-making film. So Thalberg was right about that. To the purists among the Marx Brothers fans, Night at the Opera and Day at the Races are sort of the beginning of the end of their pure comedy, because that so much time was spent with lavish production numbers and focusing on the hero, Alan Jones, in those two films, and making sure the villain was punished. And it seemed like the Marx Brothers sort of were taking a back seat to the plot, which never mattered a lot in the Paramount film. But as I say, those were the biggest money makers. And after that, the quality of their films declined. They made Room Service and At the Circus Go West, the Big Store, 1941. And at that point, they decided to break up. And Harpo and Chico had a dance band in the 40s, and Harpo would make appearances, and sometimes they would appear together. But Groucho went off on his own. And by the way, the mustache that he had in the films was grease paint. That came about because he used to apply one that required glue when he was on stage. And one night he showed up late to the theater and didn't have time to deal with the artificial mustache and the spirit gum and waiting for it to dry. So he just dabbed his finger in grease paint and smeared it across his upper lip, and he got just as many laughs. So he figured, why should I bother with all the chazarai of fake mustache? I'll just use this, which he did. And then after the brothers broke up, well, here is what Groucho looks like with no makeup on. In the next picture, nice Jewish boy. He is, I would say, virtually unrecognizable in this disguise as Julius, his real name. And this was a plus and a minus. The plus was he could go about town and people wouldn't pester him with questions and autographs and critics and all that sort of thing. The downside was he didn't get the ego stroking of people going, oh my God, I love you, you're my favorite actor, that sort of thing. But he really was incognito as himself. And Groucho told a story that in the 20s, Harry Houdini had his act at the Winter Garden Theater in New York. And he was supposed to do a trick where he puts a bunch of needles in his mouth and a wad of string, and then he pulls the string out and the needles are threaded on it. So he needed a volunteer from the audience, and he picked Groucho, not knowing it was Groucho because he looked like this. And to make sure that there were nothing set up ahead of time, Houdini said, look into my mouth and tell everyone what you see. And Groucho looked in and said, Pyrrhia. So I think Houdini learned a lesson there about picking your people out of it. But the other side of that was, as I say, not getting recognition, because in 1942, Groucho was part of the Hollywood Victory Caravan, which was a bunch of stars, really top-notch, Laurel and Hardy and Groucho and James Cagney and Claudette Colbert and Greer Garson and Pat O'Brien. There are a lot of stars that traveled by train selling war bonds to help our brave boys. And they would get to a town and they would get off the train to cheers from people that knew who was inside. But then Groucho would get off looking like this and there'd be no cheers. So he would run around and get back in the train and put on his grease paint and come out and everyone would go crazy because it was Groucho. Anyway, Groucho in the mid 40s decided to grow his own mustache. He had his own now and again in the 20s, but for the most part he was clean shaven. But he grew a natural mustache when he was signed up to do a radio show called You Bet Your Life. And this next picture is probably familiar to a great many of you. Some of you probably discovered Groucho first from his quiz show and only secondarily from the films he made with his brothers. You Bet Your Life debuted on radio first in 1947. It was produced by John Goodell, who also produced Art Linkletter's show. And on Linkletter's show, they had a gimmick where they would set an alarm clock. And as Linkletter would be interviewing people in the audience, whenever the alarm clock went off, whoever he was talking to had got a prize or some money. And Goodell thought it would be a good idea to have that kind of thing on Groucho's show, basically to keep people tuned in so they'd never know when the surprise would happen. And that's where the secret word came from, where if one of the contestants happened to say a common word, something you see around the house, and you know, it could be spoon or telephone or something like that, a duck would drop down out of the ceiling with the word attached to him, and the contestants would divide $100. So that was the origin of the secret word. And the reason it was a duck was because Groucho thought ducks were funny looking animals. So it was a duck. And he was introduced by George Fenneman, who would say, here he is, the one, the only Groucho. The writers had originally wanted to introduce him saying, here he is, the funniest man in the world, Groucho Marx. And Groucho said, I don't want to be introduced as the funniest man because first of all, I'm not the funniest man in the world. And second of all, you're setting up expectations that I could never hope to meet. So that's where the one, the only Groucho came from. And his show lasted for quite a while. It was on the radio from 47, then in 50 went on television and radio, and lasted in first run until 1962, which is a really healthy run. And Groucho, I think it was the happiest part of his career because he only had to come in once a week to film the show, and he got more money for that than he did on Broadway or in film. So it was easy. He said that at one point in the early 60s, someone asked if he was interested in running for governor, and he asked how much it cost, how much it paid, and they told him, and he said, I make that much in 3 weeks on my quiz show, forget it. So he never got into politics because he was happy with that. So after You Bet Your Life was canceled, in the 60s and the early 70s, Groucho was in basically a sort of semi-retirement and slowly became this old man with the beret and turtleneck and glasses. And he did the Hollywood Squares, he did the Dick Cavett Show and the Tonight Show, but he wasn't really attached to any regular project, and was divorced from his last wife. Groucho was married and divorced 3 times. As he said, I married my wives for their beauty. None of them had anything upstairs except another man from time to time. So at this point, I'll stop in the Groucho narrative and go back to me to tell you that by the time I was in high school, I guess, I had become obsessed with the Marx Brothers. It's difficult to explain why I felt so drawn to them. It's like, I mean, some people love Picasso and some like Norman Rockwell or prefer Nat King Cole to Little Richard. I mean, there's no right or wrong, but there was something about the blend of physical comedy with really clever wordplay that appealed to me. I mean, the Marx Brothers had people the caliber of George S. Kaufman and S.J. Perelman writing material for them, even though there was physical comedy and you know, a lot. They were miles more refined than say the Three Stooges, who were only physical comedy. And there was just something about them that it really resonated with me. And Groucho was my favorite. He could say the things you wished you could say without getting, you know, sent to the principal or in trouble some other way. And I just, I read everything I could find on the Marx Brothers and Groucho, books, articles. And of course, in those pre-TCM, pre-videotape, pre-DVD days, I couldn't just call up pictures I wanted to see and watch the movies, on a monitor or something. I had to go through TV Guide and read what movies were showing in the netherworld of late night, early morning local movies with all those car commercials. And I would just sort of will myself to stay awake past Carson, past the Tomorrow Show, into that strange twilight world. And that was where they relegated old movies. But in that way, at least, when I was younger and could just decide to stay up all night, I managed to knock off a number of Marx Brothers films and other classic movies that I had started to get interested in. In 1930, the Marx Brothers made Animal Crackers for Paramount. And in the late 50s, Paramount sold their catalog of older films to MCA Universal, who then syndicated them for television. You probably remember that shield that said MCA TV release, which used to drive me crazy that it didn't say an MCA TV release. But those were the old Paramount films. But they didn't include Animal Crackers in that group because, essentially due to a clerical oversight, the copyright had expired and the rights had reverted back to the writers and composers of the stage play, George Kaufman, Laurie Riskin, Harry Ruby, and Bert Kalmar. And Universal didn't think there was any reason at all to spend money to untangle a legal snag on this creaky old black and white Marx Brothers movie when they had new movies to promote. So for Marx Brothers fans, Animal Crackers became this missing link. They only made about a dozen movies. They weren't like Laurel and Hardy or the Three Stooges or Chaplin or Keaton, where they, every year made movies for decades or made a series of short films that just kept cycling through. There's only about a dozen of them. And Animal Crackers was at least rumored to be one of their best. That Groucho was Captain Spaulding. That's where his "Hooray for Captain Spaulding" theme came from. The line about shooting an elephant in my pajamas came from that. And I ended up seeing a bootleg print of it in late '73 at a theater in Orange County. I went with my friends, and I thought it was a horrible print, but it was great to be able to see it. And I thought, I'll bet Groucho Marx would like to see this in my naivete, just thinking, how can I let Groucho Marx know it's playing in Orange County? Maybe he wants to see this movie. And I knew his address and phone number weren't in the phone book, but I also, from looking through the Beverly Hills phone book, I knew that Harry Ruby's number was in there. And Ruby, as I mentioned, was one of the writers on Animal Crackers and co-wrote Who's Sorry Now and I Want to Be Loved by You, and Three Little Words. And I also knew that he was one of Groucho's closest friends for decades. So I called to tell him, and he was taking a nap, but a nurse took down my name and phone number. And if she hadn't, none of what happened would have transpired. So I'm glad he was taking a nap, because it meant that there was a record of my name and phone number. And he called me back. And at the time, that was a huge thrill, talking to this guy that was such good friends with Groucho and knew them back in the 20s. And he said, okay, I'll tell Grouch. And I thought, oh my God, he's going to tell Groucho. Oh God. And in, let's see, January, it was New Year's Day of '74. I got a call from a woman named Erin Fleming. And in this next image, you can see Groucho and Erin Fleming, who was a youngish Canadian actress who had become Groucho's secretary at first. And then she became his manager and really was kind of in charge of his life. And they had been on the cover of Esquire. And again, because I was such an obsessive fan, I knew exactly who Erin Fleming was, that she was, you know, the keeper of she guarded the Golden Fleece. And she wanted to take me to Universal as exhibit A of a kid that would go all the way to Orange County to see Animal Crackers. She wanted to take me to Sid Sheinberg's office, who was the president of Universal, and say, see, this kid went to go see it, so it's worth you guys spending the money to clear the rights and re-release the movie. But Erin and Groucho, they had to go from that phone call because they were going to see Woody Allen's Sleeper. And I made arrangements with Erin to stay in touch with her. And in the interim, my friends and I came up with the idea of, instead of just sending me to Universal, why not start a petition drive to show that there were many, many young people who would like to see this lost Marx Brothers movie. So at UCLA, where I was at the time a history major, we formed the committee for the re-release of Animal Crackers. And it was on Bruin Walk, we had a table. We were there amongst all the other activist groups like Hare Krishnas and Legalized Marijuana and Gay Rights and End the War. And here we were trying to get a 1930 Marx Brothers movie dusted off and back. And people, this was, you know, during Watergate, and people were so paranoid. They were hesitant to sign the petition because they said, is the FBI going to get a copy of this? Or do you have to be a registered voter? Do I have to use my full name? No, it's just a show. So I arranged with Erin to have Groucho come to UCLA. And in this next picture, you will see that is me gazing in disbelief at my hero. I've got my mutton chops. That was during my Chad Everett period, my mustache and a full head of hair. And there was my hero sitting next to me. I said, Groucho, I am very happy to be meeting you after all this time. And he said, well, you should be. And Erin said, this is Steve Stoliar. He's trying to get Animal Crackers released. And Groucho said, well, did you get it? And I said, not yet, but we're working on it. And he said, well, you better or I'll fire you. And I said, I didn't realize I was working for you. How much are you paying me? And he said, a little less than nothing. And we were off and running. And I couldn't believe I was just chatting with this guy I had only admired from a distance. And because, you know, he had gotten old and frail, I was sure that I would never get to meet my hero. And here he was, slowed down with age and health problems, but still Groucho Marx. I remember one of the news people there, because there was press all over the place. And you can see some of the people behind us, they had to keep the students back because Groucho would speak in this sort of whisper and they wanted to hear what he was saying, but there were hundreds of kids and, you know, the news people with microphones and cameras. And I remember one woman said, Mr. Marx, what is the purpose of your appearance here today? And he said, I expected your lunch. And she said, but no, besides that. And he said, I may get dinner. And that's how it was. And we talked about Animal Crackers. And someone said, what do you think of how the younger generation has embraced the craziness of the Marx Brothers? And Groucho said, well, of course, I'm flattered by it. Last Halloween, 3 kids came to my door dressed as Hoppo, Chico, and Groucho. And I said, what did you give them? And he said, I sent for the police. So we had a grand old time. And so, okay, we go back to my smiling face. Universal relented. We embarrassed them into basically saying, fine, we'll clear the rights, we'll put the movie out in 2 theaters. They'll put it in the UA Westwood for the UCLA crowd and in New York for the Manhattanites, and that's it. We don't want to hear anything. And I went to the re-premiere with my family and the Animal Crackers kids that were on my committee, and it was so gratifying. I rented a tuxedo and to see it on the big screen and a clear print of it finally, not that murky thing I saw the year before. And it ended up breaking the box office record at the UA Westwood that had been set by the French Connection several years earlier. So that was really gratifying to show Universal that it wasn't just, like 12 kids that had nothing better to do. But, I would sit in a coffee shop in Westwood and I would look out and see this line going along the wall of all of these kids in t-shirts and Keds and blue jeans waiting to see this 1930 Marx Brothers movie. So that was great. And then that summer, I had 3 jobs fall through, for which I remain eternally grateful. And my dad, of course, was saying, I don't want you sitting on your fanny all summer. I want you to go out and get a job. You can go to Taco Bell and see if they want someone. And I thought, I don't want to work at Taco Bell, but I knew he was going to be after me to not sit on my fanny all summer. So I figured I had nothing to lose, and I called Aaron Fleming and I said, is there anything at all that you think I kind of maybe sort of could? And she said, well, actually, we need someone who knows their Marx Brothers, who can handle all of Groucho's fan mail, which has gotten so big, and also to organize all of Groucho's memorabilia that's going to be donated. And I thought, oh, please, 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 please. And she said, you can make your own hours and come and go as you wish, and you'll have your own room to work in at Groucho's. And I thought, and they're going to pay me money to do this? And sure enough, I got to work inside Groucho's house. And here is a photo of my hero and me in his backyard in November of '74. I felt like I was posing next to a prized marlin that it had taken me months to land. That finally there we were side by side, and really kind of a nice picture. And it was just an amazing experience because there I was inside with my hero talking about really whatever we wanted to talk about. I was always welcome at the lunch table. It wasn't like the help had to eat in the kitchen. So no matter who came by, whether it was Jack Lemmon or Steve Allen or S.J. Perelman or whomever, or no one, I was able to sit and have lunch with Groucho. And I came to appreciate him on 3 distinct levels. First of all, this was Groucho Marx, the guy who was on You Bet Your Life and who insulted Margaret Dumont and danced around on the stage and all that. Second, he was someone who knew so many mythic people personally as friends, W.C. Fields and George Gershwin and James Thurber and Irving Berlin. And, the idea that he knew them in 3 dimensions in color blew my mind. And also he was a man from 1890, which was just extraordinary to me. His firsthand memories went from before the Wright brothers, mixed up my brothers, before the Wright brothers to after the moon landing, which is just a staggering chunk of time. I asked him once, how far back can you remember? And he said, I guess the Spanish-American War, which was 1898. And as a kid, the brothers started out as singers in vaudeville, and Groucho appeared on a bill at the Metropolitan Opera House one night as a singer, and it was to raise money for the victims of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. And Enrico Caruso was also on the bill. So he was this living time capsule. And I was happy to see that even though he was older and frail, the mechanism that made him Groucho was still there. He used to enjoy getting the Hollywood trade papers, Daily Variety and Hollywood Reporter. And he came to the lunch table one day. He said, "Wonderful mail you brought me, nothing but requests for money." And I said, "But you got Variety, didn't you?" And he said, "Yes, a variety of requests for money." And one Christmas, he got a tin of candied almonds from Fred Allen's widow, Portland. And he said, "Send her one of my Christmas cards." And I said, "Don't you want to say anything personal?" And he said, "Well, tell her thanks for the nuts. Hope you're the same." So it really was just this amazing period for me. After I had been there a while and got a little into it, I decided that it was time to have him sign this picture that I had socked away until we had more of a rapport. It was an original portrait of him from '39. You can see that his mustache is clearly fraudulent, that it is just grease paint. And I said, "Can you say something personal so people won't think that I just ran into you?" And he said, "What do you want me to say? I love you?" But he put a great secretary. Then he handed it back to me, and I said, "But you have to sign it so people won't think it's Ernie Kovacs." So he added his name. So that was a real treat. Okay. I handled autograph requests. He was meticulous about signing photos. I thanked him on behalf of all the fans out there. I said, "You know, a lot of big stars wouldn't take the time to do this." And he said, "It's part of my job," which was, you know, I think really decent of him. There was so much memorabilia, scripts with his handwritten notes and letters and clippings from vaudeville that his wives had carefully pasted into scrapbooks. And it was just an astonishing period of time for me to go through when I was 20, basically. In 1930, Groucho had written a book called Beds, and it just had one printing and quickly went out of print. So in '76, they were going to reprint it with some new photos added. And in this next shot, this is one of the pictures that was taken for it, although it didn't appear in the final book, unfortunately. The balding fellow in the upper right was Hector Arce, a very nice man. He was Groucho's biographer. He thought he looked too fat in the picture, and so he pulled it, which is too bad, because I love this picture. Groucho is in bed posing with his cook, Robin Heaney, and then directly above Groucho is one of his nurses, Barbara. Then next to them, Tom Wilhite, who was Groucho's press secretary, who later went on to be a big Walt Disney Company executive. There's me with my raised eyebrow looking at Groucho and Robin. And behind us, overseeing everything appropriately, is Aaron. And then in front of Hector was the nurse's son. Anyway, I love that shot. And sorry it didn't go in, but at least I had the foresight to get a copy of it. Okay, now, I forgot to mention that I did see Groucho once before UCLA. His one-man show in 1972 at Carnegie Hall. He also did it at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles. And the ticket was $9.50, which was an enormous amount that would not buy parking at the Dorothy Chandler now. But it meant the world to me to be in the same room as Groucho Marx, even though I was way at the back, because I felt like my applause was going to hit his eardrums, and that was as close as I'd ever get. So even though he was older and slower, it was a riveting experience. And then in the parking lot, going to get my car afterwards, I spotted Zeppo Marx. And in this next picture, you can see what Zeppo looked like then. Still had that kind of equine profile. He had just become divorced from Barbara, who threw him over for Frank Sinatra. And he was there with a very, very young blonde. And I thought, well, I'm never going to meet Groucho, but I'm at least going to meet one of the Marx Brothers. I'm going to meet Zeppo. And I recognized him again because I was so obsessed that I knew what he looked like now. And I went over and I said, Mr. Marx, I just wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed you in your movies. And he said, you didn't enjoy me, you were enjoying my brothers. And I thought, gee, I'm so glad I took the time to pay him this compliment so that he could snap back at me. But anyway, dissolved to 2 years later when I'm working for his brother in his brother's house, and I get to spend time with him under much more relaxed conditions. And I happened to be at Groucho's for dinner with the young lady that I was dating at the time, Linda. And she was very attractive and bright, had a great personality. And Zeppo just kind of became smitten with her. He was clearly intrigued by her and attracted to her. He said, you know, Steve, you and Linda should come visit me in Palm Springs sometime. I'd love to have you visit. And I said, I don't know. I was there when I was a kid and it was just sweltering. And he said, well, when were you there? During the summer? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, you know, Steve, it's cold in Alaska during the winter too. So he was, in fact, very funny and lit up the room when he walked in. He really didn't get the credit he deserved for being a character. He seemed much younger than he was. Anyway, Linda and I broke up. And around that time, I found a couple of vintage photos with just him and Groucho that I thought I'd have them sign because it would be cool that no one would say, oh, it's too bad Chico and Harpo didn't sign these because they had died in the early 60s. But since these, so I sent them to Zeppo along with a cover letter saying, Linda and I broke up. Do you have any advice for the lovelorn? And he called me up and he said, I got the pictures. God, I was good looking back then. And he said, listen, I don't want to step on your toes, but do you think that Linda would go out with me? And I thought, what? Here I call him figuring he'd been around the block a few times. And he said, because if this is at all awkward for you, Steve, I wouldn't want to step on your toes. That's the last thing in the world I'd want to do. And I said, no, she liked you. You sure now? And I said, let me ask her. And so I checked with her and she thought it was kind of an intriguing thing as well, just for the experience. So, okay. They went out on a date. He took her to dinner in San Diego, and then to attend a Highlight game in Tijuana, which I guess was Zeppo's first date, dinner and a Highlight game. And he said, I want you to know, Steve, she was very nice. I didn't even kiss her goodnight. You should know that. She was very nice, but all she did was talk about herself. And then I ran into her on campus and she said, Zeppo was very nice, but all he did was talk about himself. And I thought, well, it has a certain symmetry to it. And then after that, I was, whenever I would be at a party at Groucho's and Zeppo would be there, he would find someone to introduce me to and say, this is Steve. He and I dated the same girl, but he got further with it than I did. So she was 19, I was 20, and he was 74. So anyway, I have the distinction of being able to say that. So as I say, the galaxy of stars who came by was jaw-dropping. One day, George Burns came to lunch, and I think we have a photo of the two of them, uh, not from that day, but from that period. And I was a little nervous, and he rang the bell, and I answered it, and he had a big smile on his face, and he said, "Hi, you want to live a long time? Become an actor. You'll live to be an old man like Groucho and me." Okay, let's see. And we were off and running, and I sat there just astonished as he and Groucho would sort of argue about whether something took place in 1912 at B.F. Keith's Theater or at the Orpheum in Chicago, just realizing how much history the two of these guys had. And afterwards, he took out a cigar. By the way, Groucho had given up cigars for his health, and I was very grateful because even though it was his trademark, I hate the smell. But his friends still smoked it. And Burns took out a cigar and pushed it into the holder and lit it up. And he said, "I never smoke expensive cigars. All I care is if it fits the holder. Now, Milton Berle pays $2 a piece for his cigars. If I paid that much, I'd go to bed with it before I'd smoke it." So that was a memorable afternoon. And then at Groucho's 85th birthday in 1975, Bob Hope happened to come by, and there is that's Groucho's living room. Hope is in a tuxedo because he's on his way to a testimonial charity dinner for Danny Thomas, but he stopped by to pay his respects to Groucho on his 85th birthday. And Groucho said, "This is the man who has made me laugh." And Hope said, "Oh, Groucho, you don't have to say that." And Groucho said, "If you weren't here, I wouldn't say it." And Hope said, "It's been going on like that for 40 years. And then, to my astonishment, he did a bunch of material about Danny Thomas, and he was using us to test his Danny Thomas material for later in the evening. I thought, here he is in Groucho's living room, and he's saying, "You know, that Danny Thomas, he's so religious, he has stained glass bifocals, but I want to tell you." But it was still really cool to have him stop by and practice on us. Okay, so another legend was Mae West, who really was to Paramount what Groucho was to Paramount. They were like the king and queen of early Paramount comedies. And Groucho didn't tend to be nervous when there was famous people, because he was a famous person, and he enjoyed the company of writers more than he enjoyed famous people. But she was coming over, and Erin Fleming was she wanted everything to be perfect. She had the cleaning people in to make sure everything was just right, and food and this stuff. And she said something that you should never say to Groucho, which is, don't say anything that might embarrass him. Which is like telling a kid, don't touch the wet paint to see if it's dry, or the hot stove. And two of the things that were fairly well known at the time, one was when Mae West was making My Little Chickadee with W.C. Fields, she and Fields hated each other. I think their giant egos bumped into each other. And so they didn't even speak on the set. If they had something to tell the other, they had an intermediary pass notes. So it was well known that Bill Fields and she did not get along. The other thing was, in the 20s, she was arrested for indecency for being in a play in New York called Sex. I don't know why that would have been controversial to be in a play called Sex, and in fact had been jailed. So she came over, and this next image, you can see what Mae looked like back then. She had very pale skin. She never went out during the day, and a questionable explosion of blonde hair on top of her head that she insisted was real. And she was actually 4'11" in her bare feet. I know, in old age, people lose some height, but she really was kind of a tiny woman, which is a testament to her on-screen power, that she seemed much bigger. So she came over, and the first thing Groucho said was, "Hey, Mae, what do you hear from Bill Fields?" And she said, "In your dreams, Groucho, in your dreams." And then a short while after that, he said, "Didn't they throw you in the pokey once?" And she said, yes, but I always managed to wiggle out of tight situations. And she wiggled her body. And I thought, this is just amazing. And she went over to the piano. Harpo's son, Bill, was there that night. And he played a sort of honky-tonk version of Frankie and Johnny. And then she did some reciting, a poem she had written called Pleasure Man. And it was just this amazing tableau to see Mae West with Frankie and Johnny playing and her talking about loving and losing. And here's Groucho watching her. So it was just an amazing, amazing thing. Okay, now it was also, as much as it was my dream coming true, and it literally dream come true, because I used to dream about meeting Groucho and it was so vivid. And then it would I would wake up and it would start to dissolve. And it was like, oh no, it was so tangible. The dark side to my job was getting close to my hero as he was fading out. And also having to deal with Erin Fleming's mercurial personality, because she really was an impossible woman to deal with, but Groucho was very fond of her. And so even though she would explode in rages and slam doors and scream and hire and fire people, however, whatever whim she had about it, she was in charge. Towards the end of Groucho's life in 1977, there was a big fight between Groucho's son Arthur and Erin over conservatorship of Groucho. And there were basically, and this is such a classic scenario, the younger woman comes in and alienates the longtime friends and family members as the curtain descends. And even though no one seems to think there was ever any kind of romantic physical relationship with Groucho, he was, he loved having the attention, and she was attentive to him, even though she drove his blood pressure up with her screaming, and it was some form of elder abuse. And it was a difficult line for those of us in the household to walk, to try to stay on the good side of someone that may not have had a good side. But during that period, the interim conservator was appointed by the court, and was Nat Perrin, who had been one of Groucho's longtime friends and worked on Monkey Business and Duck Soup and created the Addams Family. And he had a legal background. And he was in charge of refereeing the two factions. And he actually put me in charge of the house on weekends. And I would stay there helping to arrange when the Erin people and friends were going to come and when the Arthur people were going to be there. And it was quite a responsibility, but I was happy to do it, to try to make Groucho's final days as stress-free as I could manage. So then this last picture of my Marx days was the three Marx brothers that I knew at the time: Zeppo, upper left, Groucho, and Gummo, upper right. Even Gummo had a sense of humor. I didn't have any pictures for him to sign. I gave him a 3x5 card and asked for his autograph, and he signed it. And he said, if this was at the bottom of a check, it might actually be worth something. So, I thought, what must it have been like when all the five brothers were around at the height of their power? In August of '77, Groucho finally gave up the ghost and passed away. It had been an astonishing 3-year run, and really changed my life being in that atmosphere. And then, I got a job working at Universal Studios in the steno pool, typing scripts every day from 11 to 8, the Rockford Files, Columbo, Kojak. And during my time working for Groucho, I had begun corresponding with Dick Cavett, and Cavett loved the fact that I was a pipeline into all the intrigue at Groucho's house with Erin and Arthur and all that stuff. So when Groucho died, I figured, well, that's it for my connection to Dick Cavett, because why would he want to stay in touch with me now? And he called me from New York that week, and he said, listen, just because Groucho's gone, I hope we're not going to lose touch. And by the way, I hope you don't mind, but I've shown some of your letters to Woody, and he says they're very well written. So I emptied the urine out of my shoes with that 1-2 punch. And it was really wonderful of him to call, because we had become friends. And in fact, in '82, he hired me away from Universal to become a writer at HBO in New York. And this is a picture of us on the set of a very short-lived show called HBO Magazine. There's the two boys being silly, me holding up 2 fingers behind him. And that was great. And I adored my time in Manhattan. I got to hang out with Cavett, and we would just go strolling through Central Park or checking out shops or getting a bite to eat. And I got to meet Katharine Hepburn and Woody Allen through him, and it was great. And then I ended up, work kind of dried up. So I ended up moving back to Los Angeles and becoming a writer for other shows. I had a better offer out there. And so I very regretfully said goodbye to Manhattan, and ended up writing for Murder, She Wrote and Simon & Simon and the new WKRP in Cincinnati, and did voice work for cartoons and radio. But as you see in the next picture, Cavett and I remained friends. And if he came out to LA, we would get together. This was backstage at Comic Relief in 1987. I was doing impressions, and I love how genuine his laughter is. It's always a kick to be able to make him laugh. And then in the 90s, over the years, people had said to me, why don't you write a book about your Groucho days? And I thought, I don't have enough to say. I was such a footnote just there at the end of his life. But I would have lunch with people and tell them specific stories, and they would seem to be interested in it. So I thought maybe I could cull together some of the best stories and maybe write an article for Vanity Fair or Esquire or something like that. And so I started this sort of archaeological dig of going through all my old notes and letters and clippings. And I finally set down in chronological order the events, and I'd gotten to page 9 and hadn't met Groucho yet. And I thought, this is going to be longer than an article. And then I worried, which is one of my great skills, I worried that it would be too long for an article and too short for a book, that I'd end up with this, 47-page, what is it? But I did actually get a book-length manuscript. And this, getting back to our first photo, is the result. Oh, that's nice. That's pretty. Oh, back to the first picture of, not a picture of a glacier and someone running on the beach, despite what you've read, of the first picture of the cover of my book, unless Judy has fallen asleep or, oh, there it is. Thank you. And that is the result. The hardcover came out in '96, and then in 2012, I did this reissue with a new chapter at the end about what had become of the dramatis personae who had been in the book. And it's available on Amazon in Kindle and audiobook with, big surprise, me doing voices. And you could also order a copy signed to you if you like by going to my website, stevestoliar.com. And there you see my name in giant red letters, which wasn't my idea. And also, and the cover art was done by the great Drew Friedman, who has done covers for The New Yorker and Times Book Review and a lot of other things. And it is currently being developed as a motion picture, which blows what's left of my mind, because Stevie at 20 is going to be one of the three main characters. It's not a biography of Groucho. It's going to be about Groucho's last days and this impressionable kid that meets his hero and this ambitious, mercurial woman in charge of the man's life. And it's going to be interesting. And in the years since I moved back to LA, I have become friends with Woody Allen. And when he was out here shooting Cafe Society, we were talking about casting. And he said, and nobody knows what you look like. You could get Orlando Bloom to play you. Which I guess it's true. Nobody but, my cousins and family, sisters and whatever would know what I look like. But in fact, even Orlando Bloom is too old to play me. So it is currently in development, and I'm not sure when it will shoot. The COVID monster, of course, has frozen a lot of things for now, but it is actively being created, and it will be something for me to see it unspool on a screen, large or small. Anyway, I have taken more time than I was allotted, which was not very thoughtful of me. I don't know if you still want to take questions or if everyone else has long ago left. And so that is my spiel in a large nutshell.
Steve,
Go ahead.
Thank you so much for all of the education about the Marx Brothers and for your time. I also want to thank Cheryl Watley and especially Jackie from our committee who brought you to us, and we appreciate everything. And if there are questions for Steve, I'm happy to open it up now.
You can answer them too.
No, I'll try. So just go ahead and unmute yourself if you want to ask any questions.
Hi, this is Susan Balk, and I have a question.
Sure.
It sounds from the way you've described Groucho's responses to questions that you asked or to entrees by people that he was sort of negative. Everything was sort of modest to negative, and I wondered. Would you have thought he was a happy person, an unhappy person?
Well, those are sort of separate things. One is his character, his image, his persona, although that, as I say, stemmed from his actual personality, because he was, Der Dunkel, the dark one. He was Groucho, right. Not Corgilo or Warmo. And in
right.
fact, people look forward to being insulted by him. And I think sometimes they would be disappointed if he was nice to them. If he was at a restaurant and he called the waiter over and said, this coffee tastes like this soup tastes like dishwater, he would be delighted. Oh, wait till I tell the cook that you insulted me.
Right.
So I think he envied Harpo's personal happiness, because Harpo was as angelic as his instrument would indicate. No, it is impossible to find anyone to say, let me tell you what a shit Harpo Marx was. He wasn't. He was a sweet man. And he married once, slightly late in life. He got married in 1936 to an actress named Susan Fleming, no relation to Aaron, thank God. And they adopted a bunch of kids. And Harpo said he wanted to adopt enough kids to have one in each window waving goodbye when he left for work each day. Isn't that great? And I think, but as Groucho said, he was joking about he married them for their beauty, but it's true. He was literally a Victorian, having been born in 1890, and it's too bad that he didn't go for women who were attractive, but also intellectually stimulating and conversationalist, but he had a sort of, old-fashioned approach to a woman's place. But he was friends with, for instance, Gloria Stewart was married to his writer friend, Arthur Schiefman. And you probably know her more recently as the old lady in Titanic, but in the early 30s, she was the female lead in The Invisible Man and The Old Dark House with Karloff and Gold Diggers of 35. And she was in Shirley Temple movie. Anyway, she was very attractive and she was very bright and very well read, and Groucho loved her company. And likewise, Harpo's wife, Susan, managed to have all of those things going for her. It wasn't any kind of trade-off. So and yet he just kept, his wives, again, a cliche, his wives kept getting younger, and it would end in divorce because they wanted to have parties and do fun things. And he wanted to listen to Gilbert and Sullivan and talk with his writer friends about politics. And they would get, they should have known what they were getting into, I guess, marrying. So it's a complex question, but the upside of his personality is all of the wonderful humor that came from that acid.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Tom Tobin had a question. He wanted to know if there's a Marx or Marx Brothers museum anywhere.
Good question.
Well, you see these books behind me? No, there isn't. I think, sadly, I think it would be too narrow a thing. That there's a comedy museum that encompasses, everything from vaudeville to Eddie Murphy and, everything in between. But there isn't one specifically for the Marx Brothers. And, back when I was working for him, his peers would be, it would be gratifying to them when they would meet me because they saw that I wasn't just some pot smoking, rock and roll listening hippie, but that I cared about Robert Benchley and the Algonquin Round Table and Gershwin music and that, and that this young whippersnapper knew who they were talking about. And now I'm old enough that when someone says, oh, my granddaughter's 5 and she was watching one of their movies and she was giggling at Harpo, I thought, well, now it's my turn to say, it's so nice to hear from the youngsters that still appreciate funny, because, there's a couple of generations that cannot place the name Groucho or the Marx Brothers. I have a COVID mask in the other room that Dick Cavett sent me, and it's the Al Hirschfeld caricature of Groucho, and I was wearing it at the supermarket last week, and this middle-aged woman said, oh, I love your mask. And I said, thank you. Do you know who it is? And she said, it looks familiar. I said, it's Groucho Marx. Do you know who that is? And she said, oh, yes. And she held up her index fingers and did Charlie Chaplin's dinner roll dance from the Gold Rush. And I thought, well, at least you knew it was an old comedian with a mustache. But so I run into that. But it is always gratifying when they can place the name, and particularly nice when they know all about them and can say, wow, you knew them. Tell me what it was like, which is, the book.
Barbara would like to, hold on one second. Barbara would like to know what you think of Stephen Canfor's book, Groucho.
I think it's better than pretty good. I think he did a pretty good job. There's one thing that I'll confess to being envious about, and that's that he asked me if he could use generous chunks of my book to fill in the Groucho's last years, because no one had written about those. And I gave this insider's view of what that was like. So he credited me in his book and then used a lot of information from my book. And his book had I can't remember if it was Random House, but he had a much bigger publisher than I did. So when his book came out, the reviews said, finally, we cast a spotlight on his tumultuous final years with Aaron Fleming. And I thought, well, yes, except it isn't finally, because I wrote a book that came out a year or two earlier that got into all that stuff, but oh well. But getting past, the personal, oh well, it's a pretty good book. Also, there's a book by Simon Luvish called Monkey Business, which is all about the Marx Brothers and their careers, not just monkey business. That's very good. And way back when, my friend Joe Adamson wrote a book called Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and sometimes Zeppo. that it was written humorously, for which he was crucified by critics, which is too bad, because why should you read a dry, scholarly approach to these crazy guys that celebrated anarchy and off-the-wall comedy? And Joe is a genuinely funny guy, and that's a really good examination of their movies. But my book, Raised Eyebrows, is only just about those years I was there. And in fact, when I was trying to find a publisher, my cover letter started out saying, "This is not a biography of Groucho Marx. It is the story of a fan and his hero in his twilight years." And I would get rejection slips that said, "We're not interested in any biographies of Groucho Marx at this time." And I would think, did you even read the cover letter? You're rejecting this one. But anyway, apparently I did finally find acceptance, but that, my book focuses on that, but there are other sources. And of course, now that we live in this digital age, what's also really gratifying is when I'll hear from someone, even in their 30s, saying, "Oh, Animal Crackers was the first Marx Brothers movie I saw." And I think, you don't know what it was like, what I went through to try to get it so that it was the first Marx Brothers movie you saw. But I'm sure glad I did, because it was, a literal labor of love.
Barbara Singer, did you have a question?
Actually, I wanted to say hi to Steve. And
hey, the first edition.
Well, and do you remember that I'm in chapter 6, referred to as a stranger than fiction set of circumstances, being related to Steve Singer?
Oh, see, well, this isn't going to be of interest to most of the people who, with any luck, are still there. But yes, there was. Oh, all right, now I've done it. All right, very quickly. When I was still in St. Louis, pushing 8 years old, I was friends with a kid named Steve Singer. We were, we played together back when kids could play together before the plague settled in. And we lost touch as soon as I moved. And when I started working at Groucho's, there were at least 2 large bureau drawers filled with fan mail that Aaron hadn't even opened yet, going way back. And so I had to catch up to that before I could even begin with stuff that people were sending in now meaning then. And for some reason, and I can't explain this, and I'm not a big fan of the supernatural, for some reason, I picked up one of the letters, and it was from someone that was like Steve Simpson.
Sandler.
No. Let me tell it. This is my story, hun. It was from like Steve Simpson, something like that. And I flashed on Steve Singer because he also was a Steve S name. I hadn't thought about Steve Singer in years. I was 19. It had been, And as I sorted through the letters in that jam-packed bureau, there was, in fact, a letter from Steve Singer to Groucho from University City, Missouri, saying, I wanted to see your one-man show, and I'm a big fan. And it was a really strange psychic moment. Now, people whose, heads are screwed on straight will say, you probably glanced at it and it sunk in before you saw it. But I know that that's not what happened, because it was buried under other letters, and I never did any kind of cursory skimming. But I thought that other letter way up top reminded me of Steve Singer, and there was a letter from Steve, and it was like, "Ladies and gentlemen, have we ever met before? I have summoned this." And I wrote him a letter, and I didn't hear back, and I couldn't believe that he wouldn't find it equally astonishing. And we did end up connecting a few years ago, but I didn't hear from him then, and I don't remember if it was that he didn't get it or he had moved or something like that. But that was just a sort of psychic experience I had. And so I told you it wouldn't be as compelling as the other stories, but I was obligated, like Mr. Memory in the 39 Steps. I'm on the spot and must give an answer, and an honest one. So it's nice to see you, and thanks for having my book.
We have time for, there's 3 more questions in the chat, and we'll take those questions, and then we will have to close for today. But the first question was from Lowell. Did you ever attend the round table at Hillcrest with Groucho?
No. Well, all right. His social activities had shrunk down quite a bit to the point where people tended to come visit him, although he would still go to premieres and parties, but he didn't tend to go to Hillcrest much. I think he did from time to time, but I never went with him on those few times. But for the most part, he wasn't going anymore. So I got to meet those people one at a time, Milton Berle and Jessel and George Burns, but I didn't get to see them in their natural habitat.
Robin would like to know, what was his relationship like with his kids?
It varied. His youngest daughter, Melinda, was the one that was from his second wife, and she was born in the mid-40s, and she was the apple of his eye. She was the one, he used to bring her out once a season on You Bet Your Life to sing and dance. And she really kind of felt pushed into it. So she moved to Northern California, where she lives now happily and plays the mandolin. And I heard from her when the hardcover of my book came out, someone gave her a copy, and she contacted me and she said, the universe is a little more organized now that you wrote that and said what you did about Aaron Fleming. I wished I had read it when it came out. It would have saved me years of therapy. His older daughter, Miriam, people in the family said she was the one of the 3 children that inherited Groucho's brilliance. That Melinda was nice, and then Arthur, the son, was successful as a writer and was also a world-class tennis player. But he didn't have the spark of genius that Groucho had. Miriam had that, and she also had an equal and opposite percentage of problems in her life with substance abuse and psych units and abusive relationships and all that. Groucho loved all of his children. He and Arthur had an up and down relationship that went back even before Aaron drove a wedge there. So it sort of varied, but Melinda was always the apple of his eye.
Myra has asked my high school teacher despised Groucho, want to hear why.
Hello?
Myra?
Hello, it's me that's speaking.
Alan.
Okay. Okay.
I went to high, I had one, actually it was the only Jewish teacher I ever had in high school, but he really did despise, he taught English
Literature?
literature, yeah, in high school. And the reason that he despised Groucho so much was because Groucho on his show of You Bet Your Life would frequently bring an immigrant on the show. And the immigrant would be speaking with always a heavy accent. That's how it is. And Groucho would turn around and talk just like they did. And he could do it pretty well, very well. And the crowd just thought it was hysterically funny. And so,
well, if you were going to be a contestant on You Bet Your Life, you should sort of know what you're in for. And also, they were screened ahead of time by the staff and were given an idea of the sort of thing Groucho was likely to focus on. So if they had a funny last name, or they were really short or really tall, we must remember, now, obviously, your teacher wasn't into political correctness, because that was decades before it swept the country. But I do end up hearing from people who indulge in what I call retroactive political correctness, where they say, why did he have to wriggle his eyebrows at that buxom woman? Why do you have to talk about her tight sweater? That's so insulting. It's so sexist. Or why did, he had an American Indian on and said something like, are you the super chief that runs from Chicago to Los Angeles? And it was essentially acceptable back then to do dialect stuff. I mean, that's what separated a lot of comedy back then, were stereotypical, the miserly Jewish pawnbroker and the Chinese laundryman, that sort of thing. So that was all raw material for Groucho. And, it's too bad that your teacher felt that way, but that's sort of what Groucho did. That was his bag. And if you weren't into it, there were other, there was Abbott and Costello or someone else that might not have rubbed him the wrong way. No one made him tune in each week to put himself through Groucho's insults, but it's interesting that even back then, some people were made uncomfortable by some of what he did, but he was true to himself and was not going to dilute himself to try to reach a broader audience.
The teacher was ahead of his time.
Yes, well, yeah.
About
I
this.
think we're going to have to close this program today. We have gone over and there are still some questions, but Steve,
Yes.
they would like to know if there's a way that can contact you, or you can let me know how to communicate with them, with how they could communicate with you, and I can send them an email.
If they email you, you can forward it to me, and then I'll answer it that way, as opposed to broadcasting my social security number and PIN number.
That's
You can do
perfect.
your website. The website is stevestoliar.com.
Yes, that's true. Thank you. That seems to be my sister Patty, who has, even though she knows all these stories. Yes, stevestoliar.com, which is where you can also order a signed copy of my book. There is also a contact there. You can go through that. So either way will get the message to me. Thank you,
Okay,
Patty.
sounds great. And thank you so much. Thank you, Ronnie, for being here today. Thank you so much, Steve, for such a wonderful program. It was very, very entertaining, and I'm sure everyone loved it.
You
Thank
can't be
you.
sure.
Well, I'm pretty sure.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you,
Last chance to
everyone.
beat the other couple.
Common word, something you have around the house.
Thank you,
All right.
Steve. Thank you so
It
very
was
much.
my pleasure.
Thank you, Steve.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Take care.
I'll see you in cyberspace.
Okay.
Thanks, Ronnie.
You're welcome, Harvey. Thank you, Brodsky Library and Lazaroff and Merowitz
You're
Center.
welcome. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.
Ronnie, from Judy Scissors.
Oh,
Right, dare I tell Steve that his cousin Jackie has never seen a Marx Brother film?
Okay, bye-bye.
bye.